So moving on from a whole series of fascinating and exciting talks from a very scientific perspective and technological perspective, we're going to take a slightly different view of things in the next session, looking at it from the perspective of the patient. I'm Colin Godbold. I'm an interested member of the public. I'm chair of the Public Advisory Board for HDR UK, which is a real privilege for me. I'd be very pleased to use the next half hour to talk about the diverse experience and enthusiasm of my colleagues on the Public Advisory Board, but that's not why I'm here, you'll be pleased to hear. Maybe another time. So what I'm actually going to do is introduce our National Data Guardian for England, Dr. Nicola Byrne, who is going to talk about the patient and their data. So if Nicola would like to come up. Welcome.
Thank you, Colin. And thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to be here today. And it's also very exciting when you're speaking to be following some speakers where when you're listening, your head starts buzzing with all the connections between your talk and theirs. So hopefully some of the things I say may sort of pick up on some of the themes that have come across. So as Colin said, I'm Nicola Byrne, the National Data Guardian for Health and Adult Social Care in England, and I'm also still a practicing consultant psychiatrist at the Maudsley Hospital in South London. And what I'm going to talk to is a little bit about the role for those not familiar with it, and some of my more personal thoughts about how I approach it. I want to talk about that. I've now been enrolled for 3 years, and I want to talk about some of the learning that I've had through that experience, in particular around how we might think about the conditions for public trust relating to each other, but also what matters when we think about how we approach the way we work with people's data. And I want to speak briefly about sort of looking forward, and in particular, the sort of importance of orientation and where your starting point is when you're working with people's data. So the role is appointed by the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care to be an independent advisor to government and the health and care system on all matters concerning people's health and care data. And I'm delighted that as of yesterday, I've been reappointed for another 3 years. And the mission is really to preserve public trust. And there's 2 aspects to that, both the privacy of people's data and people feeling confident about that, but also that its uses are going to be appropriate. And I have a small team, a small wonderful team, and a fantastic panel of experts that meet with me every couple of months to provide their sort of diverse expertise to help us provide guidance and advice to the system on the safe, appropriate and ethical use of people's data. And in doing this work, we draw on my predecessor, Dame Fiona Caldicott, the first National Data Guardian. We draw on her Caldicott principles that devised under her leadership about how to approach the use of people's confidential data, and I'll briefly mention them a bit later. And we also draw on what is by now a pretty substantial body of evidence about what matters to people when it comes to trust in uses of their data. And why does any of this matter? Well, of course, for any of us, when we're patients, if we are to trust the people not only in front of us, the clinician in front of us that we're giving information to, perhaps about the most sensitive areas of our lives, whether that's about our mental health, sexual behaviours, substance misuse, how much we really drink as opposed to how much we might want to say we drink, all those matters, we have to be confident about not only the person in front of us, but what's going to happen to that information downstream. And I like the idea of the data being a journey, and I think there's certainly a literal aspect to that as well, about what happens to our data as it flows through systems. So just to talk about my approach, when I started, I set a vision of better, I believe we can achieve better outcomes for everyone through the better use of data. And there's 3 sort of things that, perhaps as a psychiatrist in my background, that sort of particularly inform my thinking. The first being that, first and foremost, healthcare is a relational business. And whatever you're doing in healthcare, the success will stand or fall, ultimately, I'd argue, on your working relationships. And that's whether you're as a clinician, whether I'm speaking to a patient and hoping that they're going to trust the advice I'm giving them, or whether you are someone working across healthcare systems and deciding whether to embrace some new innovation or change technologically or otherwise, or whether you're going to seek to resist it. All these things come back to how good are our working relationships, not just with patients and the public, but between ourselves and organisations at every level, and then obviously between organisations as well. The second point I want to make, and we'll pick up on this later, is just really to have a system-based approach. When we're thinking about people's trust in their data, to really think about how information's flowing across the system. And we've been hearing a lot about silos today, and to take a system view of that. And again, we'll speak to that a bit more later. But the third point I'd want to make in terms of values is both, I suppose, a moral and a practical one, that ultimately, I think it's really important that we hold both our individual rights alongside, not in opposition to, but alongside perhaps our obligations to other people as well. And I think that's certainly true in a publicly funded health system where resources from my care may take away from resources for yours, for example. And I think these two things need to be seen together, because all the care we receive ultimately when we go for our own care rests on the data of others, the research done before. And I think there's something very important to bear in mind about the concept of paying it forward, if you like, when it comes to how our data is used subsequently, whether or not we may personally benefit from that or not. So a couple of years ago, the government produced their Data Saves Lives strategy, and I was pleased to see after consultation, they put building public trust sort of centre stage, chapter 1. And within that, there are many, many things to be done to improve and maintain public trust. And if you read about these things, that you can come away with a long shopping list of things. But I thought at the time it was helpful to perhaps borrow from Maslow's hierarchy of need that many of you will know from psychology, to think about how do these conditions for public trust, if you like, relate to each other. And it was I'm not a technical person, I don't have a technical background, but recently the data ontologies as a phrase has been one that's been coming up in a lot of meetings I've been going to about the federated data platform in particular. And I thought ontology is probably a good word, a sort of ontology of trust. How do the different components of trust relate to each other? And I think, obviously the first step is to not break the law when you're using people's data. But the thing I'd want to emphasize is that is necessary, but it ain't sufficient for people to trust you. And so what else needs to be in place? Privacy protection. Again, I'll speak a little bit more to that in a minute. But transparency. I was delighted when walking in to see Use My Data Are Here. They have done a fantastic, on their line of resource, a guide to what does meaningful, effective transparency look like. So not sort of just dumping loads of technical information online and saying, here you go, but actually communicating meaningfully with people. And I think it distills down to their phrase of say what you do and do what you say, which is, I hope I've got that right, because I always have to think about it before I say it. And the next rung, this is work my team have done, started by Dame Fiona and completed by myself, some public engagement work to look at, public dialogue work, to look at what does public benefit actually mean, an often used term, but what has to be in place for the public to perceive some work as beneficial. And there are two aspects to that, if you like, thinking about the benefit bits. How does work address the types of risks that people see around their health data being used, whether that's issues of privacy or equity? And it was interesting earlier listening to concerns about big challenges around equity in data use. How do people feel confident that the use of their data for secondary purposes isn't going to actually actively disadvantage them, or perhaps people in their community, for example? And the questions of safeguards, security, commercial profit, all those issues that the public are concerned about, risks. And then thinking about what's the benefit and demonstrating that to the public, because we found that the public are actually very supportive and want data to be used in ways that are beneficial, and indeed expect it to be used in ways that benefit the public. But that has to be made public, demonstrated to the public, and also involve the public. The question of choice is a fundamental one, coming back to individual rights and respecting the sort of agency and the dignity of human beings means making sure people have choices that are meaningful and authentic. And I think there's work to be done on the opt-out landscape at the moment in that regard. And finally, the question of public involvement, coming back to the people actually being involved in decision-making about what happens with their data and the public being involved in that. And if you like, this sort of triangle moves up from sort of demonstrating your basic competence to demonstrating more ethical use of data and how you think about that. And so some of the learnings or my observations thinking about data over the last few years is the importance of remembering at all times how deeply relational, how much relationships are embedded in health data. So when you have a data set, to think in those terms, that it embeds how much people trust the people they're providing and sharing that information with, but it also embeds how much they may trust organizations or people that may have access to it subsequently. And obviously, on other levels, say genomic data, it quite literally embeds people's relationships. But the importance of remembering what health data actually means to people. And it was interesting just now touching on primary care data as a thing in of itself, and it is different from secondary care data for many people. If you think about it, if I was to have operation for hip fracture, I may be quite unconcerned about the world and his wife knowing about the details of my hip fracture, that I had one and I had it, had it sorted. But I might feel very differently about information that's currently detailed narrative information in my primary care record if that record contains more sensitive information about myself or my family, for example. I think it's always really important to think about how do initiatives map onto the reality, the operational reality as patients and staff actually experience it. And often in data and digital worlds, there'll be lots of incredibly clever solutions and things being developed, but often sometimes wonder if things can be solutions looking for a problem. And I think it's really important to start with a problem and to think how will what you're developing actually work in practice and how will it all fit together. So for example, does someone with multiple health conditions really need another app for one of those conditions that you're going to ask or expect them to use individually every day alongside everything else? So how do things work together? And the last point about the how I'd stress is being straight with people. And when you're communicating with the public, to really be mindful of what your intention is. And is it to reassure people, make sure there's no fuss, sort of have a nothing to see here approach? Or are you genuinely wanting to communicate so people can understand what it is you're doing? And to avoid what I think of as performative virtue, saying stuff because it sounds good or it may reassure, but it's not really true. And I think sometimes there can be a bit of a corporate reality gap between the aspirations and statements of organizations across health and care, large and small, and the actual reality that people know to be the case on the ground. And it was interesting, when I was preparing this presentation, I did a quick search for how to be sincere. And this fantastic article came up, very long, about how to appear sincere to people. Of course, you could argue, you could save them time and just say, well, the best way to appear sincere is to be sincere. But putting that aside, I thought the question at the end of the article that someone had posted was absolutely brilliant, because someone had asked, yeah, but how do I appear sincere and still have an attractive personality? And I thought that is brilliant, because that's a fundamental dilemma for many organizations, I think. Thinking, yeah, I mean, obviously we want to be honest, of course, but at the same time, we want to still make sure we look good and manage our reputation. So I think that question about just being straight with people is really, really important. So I want to look forward a bit to thinking about this question of orientation. Now, in 21, Wade Gary did a review that led to the current constitution of NHS England as it is now. And in the first time I read it, in the first recommendation, I did read it as almost a sort of performative virtue piece of, we'll say this about patients first before we get onto the meat. But when I read it a second time, I realised that that wasn't the case. She was actually saying something very, very important about an orientating principle. And thinking about it more since, I think for me that's personally a little bit diffuse in terms of what does that mean, because most of us would say that we wake up and go to work in the morning because we have, in broad sense, an orientating principle to do the right thing and help people. So what does that actually look like, or how do we make that happen? And I think for me it's helpful to think in terms of your orientation, about literally sort of where are you thinking from? Are you thinking from the perspective of a developer or an academic in an institution, or can you pivot and actually think from the position of the patient and their data within a care pathway? And I want to increasingly really argue for the importance of the latter. And I think I'm just putting out the Caldecott principles there for those of you not familiar with them. And the ones I put in bold are ones that I think in coming years particular of interest to me for some of the work we're involved in now and going forwards. But I think it's important to think about trust along, as I say, along systems. We know that there's quite a lot of evidence that, for example, people trust the NHS much more than government, say, and ONS census data shows that 80% of people trust the NHS as opposed to something like 35% trust in government. But the NHS, as we all know, isn't some unitary, singular thing, and in reality, people have different levels of trust depending on their relationship with different parts of the system. So people tend to be much more trusting, of primary care than they are necessarily of distant things like NHS England, when that won't mean much to most people. And I think it was very interesting when we saw the stalled GPDPR programme. I think there were lots of issues for the public about what does this mean that my data is going to physically flow on a journey to this thing called NHS Digital? Who and what are they? And I often think, when I was being appointed in my interview, I remember mentioning that NHS Digital at that time, as it was, for most people, is this something that looks like the Pentagon, or is it 5 blokes in a porter cabin? So we all have, this issue about relationships and our networks and what we trust in, I think really matter. And of course, you could put academic institutions and commercial organisations anywhere across those circles. And we touched on linkage earlier. And I thought that was such an interesting and helpful way to describe it. There's health data and then there's health-related data. Because as we all know, actually, the determinants of many people's health are actually outside of healthcare. But what would it need? What needs to be in place for people to be confident about their health data being linked to other types of data, whether that's social care or welfare, prisons, or whatever? What needs to be in place for people to trust that? And so I'll end by just touching on sort of 3 points that I think are interesting, that I want to be thinking about more. And the first is around what constitutes direct care, what's necessary for direct care, and what can we reasonably say is within the legal basis of an implied consent when people present for care. And coming back to the Caldecott Principle 8 of people being informed so they're not surprised about how their data is being used. And that, thinking about that across care pathways rather than just at sort of organisational level. 2 bits of work we've been involved in recently are conversations, for example, with the HRA about improving how people get offered research interventions as part of their care pathway. And a second is how paramedics get access to outcomes data to know what happened to the patients they cared for once they cross an organisational boundary. And I think it's important for safe and effective direct care and the care they give others in future that they can know and find out and have legitimate access to finding out what happened to their patients. The second, coming back to this question about safeguarded across systems, we've heard something today, and I'm sure throughout the whole conference, there'll be many, many exciting things around technological solutions to privacy, and privacy-enhancing technology, which is all fantastic. And indeed, things like role-based access and audit trails and all of that is all really, really exciting. But I think we mustn't lose sight of the human element, not only for just making well-intentioned mistakes when it comes to people's data and how it, on the ground, things happen. Not unheard of, for example, loads of people's emails getting exposed because someone didn't know to use BCC rather than CC when they were contacting a group of patients, for example. We all know sometimes that healthcare letters go to the wrong address. So simple things from error, and staff coming back to core principles, more aware of their responsibilities. But there's also the question, I think, that matters about the reality that, as with any human system, there will always be a small, but potentially with great impact, number of individuals that choose to do a bad thing, even when they know they shouldn't. So there will be occasional stories in the media about a clinician, for example, who has accessed the records, which of course you now have extensive, as a clinician, you potentially have extensive access to people's notes across a very large area. People that have chosen, for reasons of intrusive curiosity, if not malicious intent, to read the notes of someone. Now, if someone doesn't, for whatever reason, those minority of individuals have the moral and ethical restraint themselves not to do it, we do need to make sure that they know that A, the safeguards are there technically as well, that there's a very significant chance that they will be found out, but it's also extremely important that the consequences of being found out are known to be very serious, whether that's in terms of their employment, legally, and also professionally in terms of their regulation. And I think that's something we need to make sure doesn't get lost as we have a very useful future focus on technological solutions. And the last point I'll make is around reasonable expectations, this question of how do we build and maintain people's expectations so the use of their data, for example, in population health management, isn't a surprise to them. And that's a piece of research that currently my team are involved in doing, and we're looking forward to seeing the results. We're working with the public to understand this better and think how we can improve how we do that in future, where obviously if people's health outcomes are to improve, we need to get much better at thinking about prevention. So I'll leave it there with the final slides, an invitation to do a search and find out more about what we do and to join our small but bijou Twitter following, and indeed to get in touch with any questions. Slightly gone over, sorry, Colin.
Nicola, thank you very much for a very pertinent and very interesting talk. I'm going to steal in and ask a question straight off, mainly because the iPad is over there and I have to go and get it for the next one. There was a question in the previous session about the state of public attitudes and confidence in Australia and Singapore. Any reflections on the state of public attitudes in England to the use of health data?
Well, I think they can be ever-changing, and I know that was alluded to, that these things are fragile and can change over time. And when you have high-profile stories, whether they're of individual actors accessing notes inappropriately or whether there are cyber attacks, these things do have an impact on public trust. I remember a few years ago, the Centre for Data Ethics and Improvement did a report which used the term that most data sharing occurs in conditions of tenuous trust. That it kind of carries on and people don't really know about it. And that's a very fragile situation. So I think that it's so important that we keep on actually trying to build strong trust, informed trust, rather than lean back and hope for the best, as perhaps has happened in the past.
Thank you. There's a question here. While the mic's coming over, I'll ask one that's come up through the network. For population and public health, we want to try and prevent people becoming patients in the first place. So we need to think about the use of data not just for that patient, but for the wider society. Is there a tension between those two needs of the individual and public health usage, do you think? And is there a balance there to be struck?
I think there's a balance to be struck, yes. And absolutely there's a tension. As I say, I think it's really important that choice is maintained. But at the same time, it's really important that people are aware about the consequences of choice and the benefits, if not to them personally, but perhaps to people they care about, whether that's their families, their local communities, or future generations. So I think it's not to say that tension isn't there, but it's to work through it, I think.
Thank you. The lady who had her hand up there.
Thank you. Thanks very much. My name's Samantha Walker. I'm Interim Chief Executive at Asthma and Lung UK. Really nice talk. Is there anything else that patient organisations can be doing, who also have a very trusted brand alongside the NHS, to help reassure or promote any of your messages?
I mean, obviously, that's great if anyone wants to promote my messages in any way. But I suppose as you were working through that question, I was thinking about the importance of amplifying patients' voices, actually, more than anything else. Because I think something I'm very keen to do as National Data Guardian is to really, that's the bedrock, you know, the evidence of what actually matters to people. So it's not, for me, what I think personally, as such, what matters to the public, and that has to be an ongoing dialogue, because what matters to people now may not be the same as in 5 years' time, and I suppose we need to continually advocate for these are questions that need to be returned to. So what people give social license for now will evolve, it will change over time as the landscape evolves, people's expectations change, and coming back to what the public are happy to give social license for, see as permissible. These are questions that routinely need to be returned to. You can't sort of ascertain what the public thinks okay at time X and say, well, we've done it now. We've done our public engagement bit, so, you know, that's it. I think you need to keep coming back to people. So I'm not quite sure if I'm directly answering your question, but...
You're
going to ask a supplementary?
No, just to say, sorry, we don't talk about it very much at Asthma and Lung UK. We don't communicate out in a particularly consistent manner about data or how important it is. So the way our community tends to, if we tell them things a lot, then when they see it in the NHS, they, oh, I've heard about that. Asthma and Lung UK seem to think that was all right. Maybe we should be a bit more relaxed about data or offer their help for studies or for... I don't know, it just strikes me there's a role that we could play that would be more consistent across our patient community, just simply because we have the outreach to be able to do that. Well, that's fantastic.
And I think for me it's about always holding risks and benefit alongside. So even perhaps if you're a researcher and you think it's quite self-evident the thing you're doing is going to be beneficial, the public may not see it that way because they may see the risks as far higher than you perceive them to be. So I think you've got to demonstrate your credible analysis of risk and mitigations alongside being on the front foot, being clearly telling, you know, impact narratives is the phrase I think, you know, beautifully summed it up, but why you're doing it and what the benefits are, because of course alongside risks of doing something, there's always the risk of not doing something, which is not in itself risk-free. So I think it's holding those two things together.
Are there any more questions in the room? Andrew, of course.
It's a welcome and wonderful talk, Nicola. So I'm going to talk about the word guardianship, but in the context that the NHS, as we know, has got huge pressures and is characterised by waste, variation and harm, and also the best performing health systems in the world really use data to really look at quality, 6 dimensions and productivity. So my question, is the word guardian appropriate? Because it suggests you lock something up. Whereas there was a chap called Bill Lawrence, who was a very distinguished social scientist, and he said we should be talking about stewardship, which is the careful and responsible management of something entrusted to your care. So my question is, should we be thinking about stewardship rather than guardianship?
Well, I certainly think stewardship's a very helpful concept. I think national data steward doesn't sound so good. Putting that aside, it's come up before, and I think it's come up in the context of when I speak. People often think, well, as guardian, I'm someone standing with a spear outside a cave saying, do not enter. And that's not the case. My strategic objectives include sort of promoting, safeguarding trust in confidentiality and use, but promoting better uses, both for individual care and for us all through research and innovation. So I appreciate the critique of the name. I've only got another 3 years, Andrew, so I'm not going to try and change it. But I think the actual strategic objectives, if you look into them, try and encompass both of those things.
Excellent. I'm conscious that we're cutting into the coffee break now. So, okay. Nicola, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating presentation and Q&A.